Chaos has been central to my life over the last few years. You see, I have kids. I have two little boys, two toddlers at home, Albert and Kramer, ages 3 and 5. So I think it goes without saying that I am well acquainted with chaos. I think the fact that I'm here this morning on time, relatively unmarred by yogurt or Sharpies or boogers, is a small success in my relentless battle against chaos that is my home life. But that's not what I'm here to talk about this morning, actually. I love my boys. I love to talk about them. But I don't think I have anything too profound or insightful to say about the chaos that is child rearing. There's probably a lot of people in this room that could give a 20-minute talk about that subject. So what I would like to talk about today is the thing that I maybe do have a little bit of insight into, and that's my understanding of chaos that I've gained through my job as a teacher. I've been teaching now for 13 years, and I teach primarily math, physics, and science. And those subjects do have a unique definition of and a unique relationship to chaos. And not just those subjects, but teaching in general, I think, can be well informed through the lens of chaos. And that's a little bit what I want to talk about today. Before I begin, as a teacher, I would have a hard time standing in front of a group of people like this without trying to drop a little bit of knowledge. So buckle up. Here's your quick history/physics lesson for the day. So, if you remember, there's probably at some point in your educational past, I think it's relatively universal that we all studied Greek mythology at some point. I think some point we learned about the big Greek gods. We learned about Zeus. We learned about Hera and Poseidon and these guys. If you remember back, these were the gods that had dominion over the earth. These were the gods that were in control of our experiences in our life here on planet Earth. So we had Zeus, who was in control of the weather and the thunder and lightning. You had Poseidon, who controlled the seas and the floods and the rivers and the droughts even. And Demeter was the god of agriculture and the harvest, and we even had Hades, the god of the underworld. So our life here on Earth was kind of controlled, and our experience was through these gods. But before that, like just about every civilization that has ever lived on this planet, before that, the Greeks also had a story for what came before, what preceded creation. Chaos is part of that story. Chaos was actually the first primordial deity. And so chaos was actually the void or the abyss that came before everything else. And I think it's interesting to note that the Greeks had a word for disorder and disruption. Chaos actually just meant void. But it's understandable to think it's understandable that the word that meant void eventually came to be chaos and confusion the way we understand it today, because we're not typically comfortable with things that don't have clear form, that can't be really well defined or have clear boundaries. And so that's how that word has evolved today to mean disorder. It's just really come from the discomfort that we typically have from things that aren't clearly defined. Okay, so the Greeks gave us the stories of the gods, and it's important also to note that these stories were not entertainment. They were not making up stories like we make up Game of Thrones. These stories were told in a way actually to rein in the chaos. These stories are how the Greeks understood their world. We live in a confusing and uncertain world, and we often make up stories to help us make sense of it, to rein in the chaos. That's where we get Greek mythology. But that's not the only tool the Greeks had to help them understand the world. The Greeks were astute observers of the natural world. And so, in fact, the guy that we often call the father of modern science, a guy named Democritus, he was a Greek philosopher and lived over 400 years BC. And Democritus is particularly known for developing atomic theory. Atom is a Greek word. Atom means can't be cut. So that Greek word that's how they understood indivisible. Something indivisible is an atom. That comes from the Greek, and it comes in particular from Democritus and his idea of atomic theory. And so here's where it comes from. Here's his thinking, is that if I want to understand the universe, if I want to understand why we're here, what we're made of, if I want to understand my ultimate destiny, where we came from, a big step in that, an important part of that is going to be to understand matter, understand what we're made of. And so Democritus' idea is, okay, if you have an apple, chop that in half, you get half an apple. Chop that in half, you have a quarter of an apple. Keep going, you're going to get down to some fundamental, simple bit. And that bit, an indivisible bit, and that bit, for some reason, something about that bit at the macro scale will give rise to an apple and all of its appliness. And that's an important insight, especially for a guy without a microscope or even a magnifying glass. That's an important idea, and it actually helps set us up on the path that humans have been on ever since there have been humans. And I think there's something innately human. We like to look around the world and go, what is all this stuff? What is it made of? How did we get here? That is just an innately human pursuit, is to try to understand. And I think the Greeks give us a pretty good contribution in that regard, and we kind of head off in that direction. So our species makes some progress in that pursuit over the next couple centuries, or the next couple millennia, and kind of fits and starts. But I like to look at like the mid-1600s, where our species really finally develops the philosophy, the tools, and the methods enabled to do real science in order to really advance that. So there's lots of people that contributed to that. I like to look at Newton. 1686, Newton comes out with his laws of motion. And you can understand Newton's publication of the laws of motion as him saying to the world, guys, guess what? I figured it out. If you want to know why the sun goes across the sky, if you want to know why an apple falls from the tree, it's not that apple has some kind of volition that wants to just be on the ground. It's not that there's a chariot tugging the sun across the sky. There are dependable, elegant, mathematical, universal, deterministic laws that govern life on Earth. And so that's a pretty big evolution in our understanding of the universe that Newton provides to us. And a couple of those things that are important to note. One is this effort toward determinism. And so what Newton is saying is that you want to understand this vast complexity of this universe. You want to understand what's going on. That there's these deterministic laws that really what's going on is that we are a part of just this playing out of some grand set of initial conditions. That it's just, and eventually we will understand these initial conditions and understand the math that's causing them to unfold, and we'll really understand the universe. That's kind of what he's saying. And he's also making a claim toward universalism, meaning that there's not this divide between us mortals and the heavenly realms. Newton makes a big stride toward breaking down the barrier between the terrestrial and the celestial. That the same law that brought that apple down to the earth is the same force, the same laws that caused the moon to go around the earth and the earth to go around the sun. It's one big universe, and that's kind of a big claim that Newton is making at that time. So starting in the maybe mid-1600s, the train picks up speed. We really accelerate in our understanding of the universe. And we start just ticking off these seemingly mysterious phenomena. We eventually understand electricity. We understand magnetism. We understand light and optics. We start to develop our understanding of chemistry and biology. And if you're living in like the late 1800s, it's pretty reasonable that you're thinking, yeah, we're doing it. Go humans. We're going to figure this out. We're going to figure out all the keys to the universe. Eventually, we'll have all the mathematical laws. We will have uncovered everything. We're not just trying to maybe push chaos aside. We are going to eradicate chaos. We'll be masters of the universe once we have all the tools. And we'll be able to predict the future. And that's just kind of the path we're on. And it's understandable, maybe late 1800s, to have that thought that, okay, give us a couple more centuries. We're going to do it. Well, like 1920 or so, that train drives off the cliff. And here's what happens. We're on this path toward determinism. Everything is going great. And like I said, if you want to understand the universe, an important way to do that is to understand what we're made of. And so we're making a lot of progress in that regard. We eventually figure out we humans and all other organic things are made of cells. That's pretty awesome. So we find out that humans are made of these nice little simple building blocks called cells. Well, before long, we peer inside a cell and we see that a cell is a whole city of complexity inside a cell. But we keep going, we improve our tools and our techniques, and we realize, and we find that there's proteins inside the cells, and those proteins are molecules, and molecules are made of atoms. So actually we do it, hooray, good job. We finally, this millennia-long pursuit, we find an atom, an indivisible bit. Of course, that party doesn't last long. We eventually discover that an atom has substructure. So you might remember from chemistry class or something, an atom is a positively charged nucleus with electrons flying around. And so we eventually peer inside the nucleus. We find there's a proton and a neutron in there. And then we peer inside the proton, and actually this journey does reach its conclusion. We do find that fundamental bit of nature we've been pursuing for millennia. And we've done it, and it was in the night, it's been a long past, but I'll say 1920. And we find that fundamental bit, and here's where it gets crazy. Once this millennia-long path, once we find that fundamental bit, that bit is not a bit at all. When we get down to the fundamental level of nature, and we've done it, at the root level, at the fundamental level, we are not deterministic little billiard balls. We are spread out, probabilistic, chaotic, random, boundless waves. That's the fundamental nature. And we're still not really understanding it, so I don't know the extent to which it's made it into the textbooks. I don't think I remember hearing this in high school, but that's actually true. This is our current understanding of the universe, is that you and I are made up of spread out, probabilistic waves, not bits. And it's not because our tools aren't good enough, by the way. It's not because, we get a little better microscope or something like that. It's actually because that's the fundamental nature. We are cloudy, we are chaotic at our fundamental core, and we don't need any better tools to help us know that. So this is a story I tell my physics students all the time, and I usually try to also highlight the metaphysical implications of this, that if you and I are made of waves that are boundless and are waves of probability, then I think it's important that we maybe let go of our pursuit of absolute determinism, because it's not there. At the root level, nature is chaotic. And so I try to let my students know that if you and I are made of chaos, then it's probably a good life outlook to become more comfortable with uncertainty, more comfortable with things that don't have clear boundaries. So that's something that I've been telling my students for a long time, but it's only been in the last couple years that I've started to internalize this myself. Probably had something to do with having kids. That I've started to internalize and let it affect my outlook on life and also how I teach. So let me explain. Imagine the perfect classroom. Oh wait, that's a factory, hold on. Imagine the perfect classroom. You've got rectangular desks in perfect rows. You've got students sitting quietly and attentively in these desks. The teacher's about to give a lecture. The teacher will talk about something. The students will write everything down. The teacher's eventually going to ask a question. Hands will shoot up. Someone in the front row will get called on. They'll answer correctly, get praised, and the teacher will move on. That's a great environment. That's learning. And that's what I tried to do for the longest time. And I was terrible at it. I could not do this type of teaching. Chaos just seemed to be the natural state of my classroom. My classroom was always full of chaos. I think about my first job. Right now, I'm in my 10th year at Charlottesville High School. I think of my first year at CHS. I was teaching physics, and I was teaching my kids. I wanted them to see how you can convert elastic energy in something like a rubber band into kinetic energy and shoot projectiles. And you can make measurements and draw conclusions. I thought that'd be a fun lab. So here's what I wanted. I wanted them to each of my kids to have this little slingshot device. So I was going to go home. I was going to take a little plank of wood, put 2 nails in it, put a rubber band across, and then I had my kids shoot things across the room and draw conclusions. So I have 30 kids. I was going to put them in teams of 2, so I need 15 of these things. So I go home. I'm about to start making 15 of these, and I realize, why deny my students the joy of making something like this? So I just throw everything in the car, and I take it to school the next day. And the next day, I give up my kids written instructions. The instructions say, get in groups of 2, figure out who in your group is least comfortable with power tools, and send them up to the front of the room. And so I had kids come up to the front of the room, and I had a big jigsaw plugged in, and they would measure a foot of wood, and they would cut it off, and then I had a few hammers. They could hammer the nails in, put the rubber band on, and start shooting stuff and start taking measurements. I thought it'd be a fun lab. One of the last groups is going, so I've got like 15 groups. One of the last groups is going. I've got a freshman girl up at the front of the room with this big jigsaw and just trying to make a straight line, and it's bouncing all over the place, and it's making a lot of noise. There's sawdust flying. And that's when my supervising administrator walks in. And so that's the scene he walks into. There's sawdust and noise, and there's power tools, and there's a couple groups still hammering their nails into the wood and probably some other things. And then the rest of the groups are shooting projectiles over. There's tape measures and meter sticks, and they're running around collecting data. And my supervising administrator takes some notes, leaves, and I get a stern letter in my mailbox the next day, and I'm not making this up. He used the word chaos. He said, Shields, that was chaos. How can any learning happen in such an environment? This is like a couple weeks into school. I'm absolutely mortified. I'm like, I'm gonna get fired. So I decide then and there, I'm gonna redouble my efforts. I am going to rid my classroom of chaos. I'm gonna get back to these nice, orderly, straight rows, and I'm gonna be a good teacher, and I'm gonna rid my classroom of chaos. That lasts like half of the first period of the next day before I feel the chaos just coming back in. It's just, I guess that's just the natural state of my classroom. And so I really tried. I kind of battled against the chaos for a few more years, but it just never seemed to work. So one summer I went home and I decided I'm going to rewrite my curriculum. And by the way, I should mention, teachers work over the summer. We don't have summers off. That's when the good teachers are writing curriculum and rewriting curriculum and refining curriculum. And I should also mention that teaching is absolutely a creative endeavor. Teachers create educational environments, they create educational experiences, and hopefully we're creating educated citizens. So I think you can include teachers in the list of creatives. So I go home this summer, a few summers ago, and I decide I'm gonna rewrite my curriculum. And the goal I set out for myself is, can I write curriculum that doesn't battle against the chaos and try to marginalize it? It actually invites it in and is actually centered on the chaos and maybe even feeds off it. That's my goal. That's the goal I give myself. And the reason I had a hunch that this might work, because I had seen it. In my most chaotic classes, I had seen learning happen. So despite what that administrator had said, I had seen that chaos can be a fuel for learning. And so that was the goal I set myself out that summer, to rewrite my curriculum. Came back to school with this kind of chaotic curriculum, and I kind of want to finish by sharing with you some of the things that I've seen in my chaotic classroom over the last couple of years. First of all, I should mention that chaos and safety are not mutually exclusive. That you can have a chaotic classroom and safety. In fact, as an educator, I know full well that learning doesn't happen without safety. If kids don't feel safe, that's a primary human thing, and so they won't learn very well. But I think about riding a bike. When you learn how to ride a bike, first of all, you don't learn how to ride a bike by reading a textbook or listening to a lecture. You learn how to ride a bike by getting on a bike. And the first time you get on a bike, it's chaotic, it's scary, there's risk, there's danger, you're wobbly, you're uncertain, but hopefully there's some safety there. Hopefully you're wearing a helmet, maybe you've got training wheels, maybe you have somebody spotting you. And that's where real learning happens. You are stretched, you're challenged, but there's safety there as well. And so one of the things I've seen in my classroom over the last couple of years as I've invited chaos into the classroom is that a chaotic classroom can be a lot more equitable. The lecture style form of the classroom it's like a one-size-fits-a-couple, if you're lucky, model of teaching. That if you stand up there and give a lecture, there might be a kid or two, that's definitely their preferred method of learning. They want to just write down notes all day long, and that's great. That's probably not the most equitable way to do it. So in a chaotic classroom, here's what I've been doing the last couple of years. I embed my content, I embed my learning objectives in a mess of chaos, and then I invite my students in to engage with that content in a way that works for them. And so I can have different kids doing different things at different paces, all engaging with the content, but it's much more equitable. The kids are doing it at a pace and in a method that works for them. And so I've kind of removed myself as the fount of knowledge in the front of the room. Instead, I'm more of a guide or a coach or a mentor. Sometimes I like to think of myself as a gardener. That's really just my role now, is to work alongside kids as they engage in this chaotic classroom. Something else I've seen increase in my chaotic classroom is creativity. If you think back to that slide of the kids sitting in desks, there's not a whole lot of creativity going on there. And you can have the most creative subject, I don't know, art, and strip it of all its creativity. You could lecture about famous artists all day long, and there's no creating happening in that classroom. You can take a class that is typically maybe less creative, like science, and it can be plenty creative. Again, if I take my content and embed it in some sort of mess of chaos, I can have my students demonstrate their mastery of that content in a way that works for them. So at the end of the year, a lot of classes, what you've created at the end of the year in a lot of classes is a stack of bubble sheets, and that's not really something you want to go home and put on the fridge. But in the classroom I've been trying to teach over the last couple of years, I have students demonstrating their mastery of content through some creative act. And we humans are creative beings. This is universal. I have not met a kid yet who doesn't want to make something. And so at the end of my year, what do I have to show for you've sat in my physics classroom for a year? It's not a bunch of bubble sheets, but it's projects and art and other forms of creation that the kids were excited about. And the last thing I've seen in my classroom over the last couple of years, it's fun. It's fun to be in a chaotic environment. We humans actually enjoy autonomy and challenge. That's something that all humans enjoy. So again, think back to the kids sitting in rows listening to a lecture. That's not autonomy, and it's not challenging. I guess it's a little challenging to write down really fast, I guess. But humans really thrive and find enjoyment out of autonomy and challenge. That can also happen in a chaotic classroom. So when I have my kids, rather than sitting in desks listening to me talk all day long, when I have my kids engaging with the content and making things, there's obviously a lot of autonomy there. They get to choose how they interact with the content and how they demonstrate mastery. But also there's challenge there, and I find a lot of enjoyment. As a teacher also, by the way, it's a lot more fun to sit alongside my kids as they make stuff than it is to just talk at them all day long. Okay, so this is not something that I think just applies. I've got slides all day long. My wife's a photographer. This is not just something that applies to us teachers and in the school environment. This actually applies to all of us. And so in closing, I just want to mention that we humans are the physical manifestation of disorder made into order. Our brains are wired to make meaning and make wisdom out of chaos. So that's all of us. And so with that understanding, I think all of us probably need to let go of a little bit of the control that we strive for, let go of our desire for absolute determinism, and embrace the chaos. I think that all of us, if we want to get the most out of what this chaotic world has to teach us, we need to step in to uncertainty. We need to embrace risk. We need to embrace the ill-formed and the formless. We need to welcome the alien and the foreign, and we need to embrace chaos, because chaos is the raw material for learning. Thanks.
So we have some time for questions. If you have any questions, I'll start. First question is, you've had a lot of success with chaos in the classroom. Have you found that that's influenced other teachers and other teaching styles at CHS or at other schools?
Great question, and I guess I don't need to repeat it. You were on the mic. Okay. Yes. Through a couple methods, through a couple avenues, I think. One, my classroom, which I guess you saw in a couple of those slides, I was fortunate enough to be able to design my own classroom a few years ago, and it's completely open. Intentionally, there's no wall. Like the rest of CHS was built in the 70s. The rest of CHS is pretty much like brick boxes, and they're very closed off, and I think teachers often have a very insular experience at school. My classroom is all either open or glass, and intentionally there's no place to lecture. And so I can't, even if I wanted to, resort back to my old moments of teaching. And so it's very open, and so teachers just walking in the hall see it. And I end up getting in conversations with teachers like, how does that work? How do you teach in a classroom without a PowerPoint? And so through the visibility of my classroom, I've been able to see other teachers engage. And then the last couple months, I've been active actually in just emailing schools and going, hey, you should try this. It's pretty fun. Yeah. Yeah, wow, that's a great question. The question was, do I tell my students that they're in the middle of a chaotic classroom? I didn't the first year. I thought I was going to spring it on them, and that would be fun. That I just walk in one day, and there's like no desks, and there's just crap everywhere. And I realized my students are mostly like 11th and 12th graders, and they've gone through 11 or 12 years of passive learning and just being spoon-fed, and so that's what they expect. And so I just thought it'd be what a great liberating experience. Guess what? We get to do whatever we want in this class. You'd think kids would jump out of their seats for that. No, a lot of brains are just resistant to that. So the last couple of years I've had to be really intentional and going, okay guys, welcome to my classroom, and this is how it's gonna work this year. I'm actually gonna ask you to be responsible for some of your own learning. I'm not gonna spoon feed you things. I'm not gonna feed you the answers. And it's, for my, I now have kids, I now have as low as 8th graders doing that, and the 8th and 9th graders, that's a year-long process of learning how to learn, because we've spent up till 9th grade teaching them the other way to learn. Yeah, good question. Yeah, and the question was, are my student-teacher relationships better? You know, there's a paradox. Yes, absolutely, they're better. I get to do that every day. I get to hear a kid go, yes. That doesn't happen in my older traditional type of classroom. If I was 100% honest, I would say I kind of miss the relationship I used to have with my kids as this just professor, and they respected me as a professor. But in order for this style of learning to work, I have to say to them a lot. I don't know. Let's try it. Let's try to figure it out. And so I now have a more coach role with them, and so they respect me as a coach, which is great. I think at the end of the day, that's a better relationship to have. But yeah, there are days I miss them. Dr. Shields, how'd you know that? Because I read the Wikipedia page right before I lectured. That's all I know. Yeah. On the way back. Yeah. Oh, wow, great question. So there's the SOLs, the standard of learning that Virginia came up with, and you're probably well familiar with No Child Left Behind, and then the problems that have come along with high-stakes testing. So in this country right now, we are still under the influence of the desire to, I get this, to collect data from students and to test them. Is education working? We don't know yet. This big experiment called Can We Educate a Whole Country of almost 400 million people? So the desire to do, so what we end up doing is we end up testing the things that are easy to test. And so we don't test creativity and teamwork. We test, can you memorize stuff? And the pendulum is swinging the other way. And I think the world of education is coming along, but it's just a big ship to steer. When I went home, I said, when I went home and worked on this curriculum, I thought I was just inventing something amazing and unique. Over the last couple of years, I have found lots of teachers, lots of schools doing this. There's now whole conferences and things like this, so I'm not the only one doing it. But it's a big ship to steer. And colleges drive a lot of what we do also. So testing and what are the colleges looking for? And so finally, colleges are accepting other modes of demonstrating how smart you are. And so it used to just be like SATs and GPA, and now more schools, MIT is doing this, are accepting portfolios and YouTube videos as a way to apply to college, which I think is great. Yes, so I've now been doing this, this is like my 5th year, and I have kids that have just finished school, and I have kids that are in the first, second year. Most of them say that this has prepared them well for college. So even though college, you're going back to just sitting in a 400-person lecture, one of the things they're learning in my classroom is how to learn. And so if what happens a lot of times, I'll just speak to my own experience. My own experience in college was sitting in a 400-person lecture, not getting a whole lot out of it, finally starting my homework around midnight and just being completely lost and having no way to get through it and just turning in empty problem sets or just crying. I don't think I had Google. And so my students now, I think, are more prepared to learn and to succeed in just a broader range of challenges, I think. Yeah, the lesson plan. So the question is, lesson planning is, at least, this is why I learned it at UVA, and this is the way I usually did it, was a very methodical, logical process. So, again, teaching isn't just, it should be an intentional act. So I have to think about, who are my students? What kind of activity can I get them initially excited about the lesson? How am I going to present it in a way that is accessible? Then how am I going to assess it? Then how am I going to reteach if they didn't get it? So there's a very logic to that. I still do that, and so in fact, a little bit's of an act in my classroom. So they come in, I'm like, wow, it's crazy in here. I still go through that process just in secret of saying, okay, who are the kids in my classroom? What's going to turn them on to this subject? How can I assess that they're learning? And one of the earlier questions about assessment, that is hard. That I've had to reteach myself or just learn for the first time, actually. How do I assess learning without bubble sheets, without multiple choice tests? And so I have to come up with ways that I can grade something. And so I'm looking at a robot. I'm like, okay, how do I know? Is that an A or a B robot? I don't know. So I've had to come up with rubrics, or what they're called, lists of evaluative measures, yeah. And the way back, yeah. So the question is about and I invite chaos into the classroom. Where does order fit in? To paraphrase, I think, maybe your question. Right as I finished, I said that the way I see chaos now is the raw materials. And so rather than invite my students into a room where I have already gotten rid of the chaos. Here's a good example. I teach science. So my first years teaching science, what I would do is I would stay up all night doing the lab myself to get rid of all the errors that might show up. And so when the kids came in, I had this well-polished lab that they could just push the cart down the hill, a number would come up, they could write it into a blank and get a grade. And so I was the one. Experimentation is chaotic, absolutely. So I would be the one getting all the learning because I was the one teasing and refining the experiment until there was no chaos left. And the kids would walk into a perfectly just pristine environment and get clean data. And that's not how the world works. And so now someone has to go through the process of starting with chaos as the raw material and making sense and making order out of that and making meaning out of that. Now I let the kids do that. And it's not, first of all, I get to sleep more, but also the kids I think that's where the learning happens, is staring at messy data or staring at a mess and going, what does that mean? And then letting them know that if you might not finish this period, and you might have to come back and collect more data. But I want you to engage in that process of staring at data and realizing, my instrument was not plugged in or whatever it is, and then cleaning up the data and making sense of it. The kids are engaged in that process. So what they turn in is orderly, and I still expect that. So my classroom's chaotic. PDFs are nice, and well formatted, and Times New Roman and all that. But so that's kind of how it works in my classroom. The question is how. So my oldest son is 5, and I don't think it's a coincidence that about 5 years ago I threw out a lot of what I know, including my desire for control, or at least my striving for control. And so, I remember those days coming home, leaving the house, having just left a house with like a 1-year-old screaming and throwing things and trying to get him to eat and changing diapers and all that, and then going to school and my brain is like, what am I doing? This is all false. Like, of course there's no control. This is all an illusion. And so just throw off my tie and just rock into the classroom. Like, there's no, come on kids, let's talk about chaos. So it absolutely was at the same time. There was something going on. My 1-year-old was teaching me to let go of control, and then I get to now teach teenagers that same lesson. So I guess it all goes back to my little boy, Albert. And Kramer.
Awesome. Let's give Matt another round. That was awesome. Thank you all for coming. Looking forward to next month, hopefully seeing you all there. And good luck with whatever you have to do today.